now, and when I end up posting this on my blog, you can help me make it better. A long time ago, just over 3,000 years ago, in fact, something so extraordinary happened that the only language we had for describing it was that of an intervention. We had been living in Egypt, a society that was governed by a predictable natural phenomenon, namely the overflowing of the Nile of its banks twice a year, allowing for a narrow band of agricultural land on either side of the river. This was a society in which surprise played a minor role. Change came slowly, and projects requiring decades to complete were the hallmark of this culture and remain so to this day. Then the weather went wild, and a series of surprise events began, seemingly one right after the other, at least as our story has it. A debate between the pharaoh of the day and someone we call Moshe began. Moshe argued that the confluence of these events was significant and heralded a major challenge to the reigning worldview and economics. Pharaoh argued the reverse, that these were a series of isolated incidents, regardless of how powerful or strange they were, and carried with them no deeper meaning, and certainly not a call for Egyptian society to rethink itself. Because of this insistence on maintaining an ideology that ran counter to the data, the chaos in Egyptian society deepened, and the Israelites took advantage of that chaos to remove themselves from their slavery and remove themselves to the Sinai Desert. On their way, one more event took place, the most miraculous of them all. Just as they seemed to be boxed in between the water and the Egyptian pursuers, a hot wind dried out the marsh called the Sea of Reeds. The Israelites gambled that it would stay dry and walked through. The wind died, and the Egyptians got their wheels stuck in the mud and had to halt their pursuit. This escape from one state of being to another, something unheard of in Egypt, convinced us that there is more to the unfolding of life than cyclical repetition, that the cycles are moving in a direction, and that direction is from less to more freedom. And over time, as we incorporated more experiences into this apprehension, we realized that we weren't safe until everyone was safe and free. We called the vision of that moment Olam Haba, or Yemot HaMashiach, and 2,000 years ago we moved the central inspiration of that hope from the Holy of Holies in the temple to the Holy of Holies, which is the 4 cubits of halacha. The spiritual force that surrounds the person whose life is dedicated to the implementation of this vision and its furtherance. Does this way of describing that moment in our past strike a familiar chord? Are we not engaged in a major discussion of the significance of the changes in climate that are taking place as we sit here? If Gaia is conscious, is she not speaking to us now? Is she not speaking to us now as we envision the Kadosh Baruch Hu speaking to us then? If what we experienced as we left Egypt remains true for us today, and if we still believe that we committed ourselves to be God's people in this world, then both ends of the halachic process take on deep and urgent meaning. On the one, we need to renew our spiritual practices so that they continue to reinforce our commitment to advance an ethical and moral vision of our future. On the other, we need to examine our behaviors to be sure that they remain connected to our practices and the visions we espouse. Remember again, the halachic process is less about the answer and more about the process itself by which we arrive at what may be only our best effort to find a tentative response for this moment. The process we call halacha, the going, is that which mediates between the inaugural experience of divine guidance and fulfillment of the vision of release and redemption for all humankind. It is not law. It is not really about answers. For us, as much as God is in the transcendence, the absorption of the self and the infinite, God is equally also in the details. The halachist is charged with helping people figure out the best way to manifest God in the detail about which the question is being asked, by examining that question in the lights of our core beliefs, our vision of a better future, and the best way for each of us to become a representative of a people for whom God is so close. So today, we're going to participate in that process. We've chosen 3 of the tshuvot that were written by 3 of our rabbis, who were at that time students on their way to becoming rabbis, representing different areas where people have applied the halachic process to an issue of immediate concern to them, and which has arisen due to the paradigmatic changes through which we are living. They have applied the principles of integral halacha so that they have new tools with which to evaluate new questions while still remaining backwards compatible. For the most part, their questions have been framed as coming from individuals relating to individual behaviors. But I would like to stress that this is not the only arena for integral halacha. For example, on the larger scale of Ohalah and our relationship with each other, how do we balance our need and desire to spend time together with the carbon footprint of our travel and hotel stay? If the mitzvah of Hanukkah candles is basically to light one candle a night for 8 nights, and only light 44, is that what it is? Yeah? 44? Is that? and only light 44 candles if we can afford to. Because that discussion between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai is about those people who can afford to light 44 lights in 8 days. Okay? Would it make sense to encourage people to return to that practice rather than burning so many candles made out of petroleum as a symbolic way of keeping us conscious of the precarious nature of our existence? Increasingly, I'm seeing that climate change is being viewed as a moral issue, which Naomi Klein stresses again and again in her latest book, This Changes Everything, and which Pope Francis is also making clear. How then do we lead by example? And how do we, play Kodesh, guide our people to find the ways in which they can both reduce their personal carbon footprints and do it in a way which is collective, gradually giving politicians the message that they can win elections by advocating national and international programs for reducing those emissions. Jewish Renewal has walked its talk for several decades. Today's panel reinforces that truth in only a sampling of the areas in which that has been true. Now we need to look at the next major issues squarely, be willing to do the same for the sake of the planet and the entire human race, of which Judaism is a small but hopefully vital part. So having said that, I would like to ask you first. We didn't decide who was going first or second, but Gloria's going to go first.
Where's Yashikwa?
I'm Chaya. Yes. So Chaya Gusfield asked me to speak on this panel to represent as best I can the ideas and research she put together in her tshuva, responding to the question, should I stay Kaddish for 11 or 12 months for a parent who suicided after struggling with mental illness? And I give these remarks in Rabbi Chaya Gusfield's honor and in memory of her father, Joseph Gusfield, Zichrono Livracha. Chaya and I wrote our tshuva almost 10 years ago, during the same senior year in the Aleph Rabbinical program. We both wrote about halacha concerning mourning practices after a close family member has ended their own life. We both have a personal stake in these issues because we are both what are called suicide survivors. Chaya's older sister, Julie, Zichrona Livracha, ended her life more than 40 years ago when Chaya was 14. And my mother, Elizabeth, Zichrona Livracha, ended her life when I was 21. Both of them suffered from serious mental illness. Both Chaya and I grew up in liberal Jewish communities that did not make sharp distinctions in mourning practices after a suicide. At the same time, both Chaya and I came away from that experience with a legacy of shame. And one of the sources of that shame was the feeling that suicide is profoundly un-Jewish. We also lived in the midst of painful, sudden silences about why and how our loved ones died. Hushed tones whenever the topic of mental illness arose. A cloud of stigma. And our experience is indicative of the general experience of suicide survivors. As someone once said to Chaya, we spend our whole lives in the valley of the shadow of death. As a result, it was not reassurance enough for us that most Jewish streams of thought and practices are quite reluctant to find any suicide was ma'abed atzmo l'da'at, a destruction of oneself with intention. It was not enough for us that most Jewish communities are lenient in permitting all mourning practices. We wanted to explore the potential distinctions in mourning practices deeply, and with an eye toward using these practices for tikkun and healing. Talking about this makes my mouth especially dry. In Chaya's tshuva, and in the related article that she later published in the journal Keren, she explored the question whether one should say Kaddish for 11 or 12 months after a suicide. So here is some context from Jewish law. Halacha related to mourning practices after a suicide all stems from, or is a reaction to the statement that I'm going to read. And all the quotes that I'll be reading from are actually from Chaya's Keren article, although I do also have a couple copies of her tshuva with me. So this is a statement from Talmud. And just so you know, this statement is also, part of that, the beginning of that legacy of shame. So this is from Simachot, a minor tractate in the Talmud. All things are done to respect the living, i.e. the survivors. So all things that are done to respect the living may be done, but all mourning customs done in respect for the deceased are not to be performed. So that's our starting point. So from that starting point, there's a gradual change over the centuries toward more leniency. And initially, where that change came from, the leniency came from, was to expand this definition of what are we doing to respect the mourners. So the idea being that if we are truly respecting the mourners, we don't want to cause them additional pain by removing many of the mourning practices that they normally would take comfort in. And so there was a gradual change, and some of that gets developed a little more specifically in Chaya's paper. And then in more recent centuries, there started to be leniency coming in so that we almost never find this intentionality. So that we say, well, if somebody was mentally ill, it means they couldn't have had the intention. So there's kind of an expanded definition of what that might be. And then you also have coming in more recent centuries, this idea of duress, that somebody may have ended their own life because of duress, and then duress itself also gets expanded so that even, let's say, desperate financial circumstances might be considered duress. So this is how we come to this point where in many communities you don't really see very obvious distinctions in funeral practices and in mourning practices. But there still are these places. There are these places and these communities and these individual rabbis who choose to do our funerals, and these communities where you hit a wall or a painful place about what to do specifically about things like burial. So in some communities, if somebody has ended their own life, they're considered a rasha, and so they're buried at least 6 feet away from everybody else, or they're buried on the edges of the cemetery. This issue about saying Kaddish, which I'll get into more deeply, and then also the issue of whether or not you deliver a hesped at all. And that actually was the topic of my tshuva, which I won't really talk about here, but I'll talk about a little bit more in the breakout session. Because it comes back to also to Talmud from Rabbi Akiva, but the general idea is that after somebody's ended their life, we mourn, but we do not eulogize. And so that also has become more lenient in many places, but again, you'll come into these places where you have these painful silences. So now a little bit of the law about how long do we say Kaddish. So right now I'm talking about after a parent has died. And this is in general. This is not specifically about for somebody who's ended their life. So Mishnah Eduyot says that the sentence of evildoers, of a rasha in Gehenna, lasts no more than 12 months. And that one traditional reason for us reciting the Kaddish Yatom is to help, the mourner's Kaddish is to help elevate the soul of our departed loved ones from Gehenna. And so then Rabbi Moses Isserles, when he was writing his gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, said we should say Kaddish for a parent for no more than 11 months, unless we know our parent is a rasha. So, we don't want to give the impression that we think they need the help of that extra month, and so we just say Kaddish for 11 months. If we know our parent was a rasha, then we say Kaddish for the full 12 months to give our parents neshama every bit of help possible. So initially there was no commentary on how long do you say Kaddish after somebody's ended their own life. But then you have the Chatam Sofer, he was late 18th century, early 19th century, and Rabbi Zvi Eisenstadt, who wrote the Pikhei Tshuva. And they both said that when a parent has ended their own life, you say Kaddish for 12 months because they are a rasha. They are by definition an evildoer. And there are communities which still follow this custom. And some argue that saying Kaddish for the 12 months is actually an act of compassion, because their neshama does need the help more to go through the levels of Gehenna. So Chaya grappled with two issues, two kind of overarching issues in her tshuva. And one is that there's a general tension. How do we reduce the stigma of suicide and mental illness and tend to the needs of the survivors while also discouraging the act? With the idea that, since our bodies are not our own, and they're a gift from God. And both Chaya and I are also chaplains, and this comes up in chaplaincy as well. And then on this issue of 11 or 12 months, so putting aside for the moment that one who ends their own life is a rasha, so let's just put that aside for the moment. What do we need to consider when deciding whether to say Kaddish for 11 or 12 months? Does this mean that we, who are, if we're the children, are we doing their work for them? Are we doing their psychospiritual work for them by doing, their work that they're doing in Gehenna? And that is a very fraught thing for a child whose parent has ended their own life. That, now we're doing their psychospiritual work for them in this real immediacy after this death that we have so many complicated feelings about. Are we making atonement for them? And the reason that the issue of atonement is important is that one of the reasons why, one of the justifications for this distinction in mourning practices is that there's this general stance among the rabbis that most sins are atoned by a person's death. But when somebody kills themselves, ends their own life with intention, the idea was they have sinned with their death. And so if there's going to be any atonement, it's going to be afterward. Does the neshama, should we be thinking of this period as a period of healing? And does the neshama of somebody who ended their own life need more help? And so then, since we are their children and we're to honor our parents, maybe it's our obligation to help their neshama. And then, if we're deciding between 11 or 12 months, particularly if we're edging into that judgment area, who are we to decide whether we should be saying Kaddish for 11 or 12 months? And then the last piece of that was, how does saying Kaddish longer, how might it help us as survivors do our own psychospiritual work, given the very complicated legacy of emotions that we're left with? So what excited Chaya in doing this research was learning the many ways in which saying Kaddish is powerful. So for those of us who have studied with Simcha Paul Raphael, read his book, Jewish Views of the Afterlife, and he really sees all of these practices, including Kaddish, as soul-guiding rituals and practices. So she was excited to find that, and that that there are these purposes of saying Kaddish, of raising the neshama, the healing for us. I mean, many of us in this room have said Kaddish for somebody, and many of us have said Kaddish for at least one parent, and it can be healing for us. And then also that there are mystical and even theurgic purposes for saying Kaddish. So I want to read another little piece from the Kerem article on that point. Besides its power for personal redemption, some rabbis attributed cosmic and even theurgic power to Kaddish. The Talmud states that since the destruction of the temple, the refrain for Kaddish is the only prayer which sustains the world. And that's from Sotah. Elsewhere, the Talmud continues by saying that when uttered with all one's strength, the response to Kaddish, Amen, Yehei Shmei Rabbah, can tear up an evil decree or achieve divine pardon, even for one who has been tainted by idolatry. So, very powerful. Chaya came across two thinkers that especially excited her, the Ari and the Peleioites, and their ideas about the Kaddish. And so they, in their writings, they were not specifically addressing the issue of suicide, but their ideas have application to our topic. So the Ari, Yitzhak Luria, thinks that we should say Kaddish for everybody for 12 months. Not just because the goal is not just that we're getting people out of Gehenna, but we're also raising them up in the levels of Gan Eden. And just a little tidbit from my paper, there's this place in Tanakh where King David cries, my son, my son, my son, regarding his treasonous son, Absalom. He cries, my son, 8 times. And 7 of those times are to raise his son out of Gehenna, and the 8th time is for Gan Eden. There's commentary on that piece from Tanakh. So the Peleioites, who's Rabbi Eliezer Papo, who's in Bulgaria, end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, says that it should keep going even after the 12 months for everyone, because we're all sinful creatures whose nishamot will need help elevating after death. And so just a little expansion on that. In the Peleioites' opinion, we all live in an orphaned generation where no one is free from sin. Thus, we all need to be exonerated from judgment for more than 12 months. Although not addressing the issue of the Rasha directly, the Peleioites implies that no one can be determined more wicked than another, because all of us need the help that the recitation of the Kaddish can offer, and we need it forever. That's Chaya's explanation. The focus of both the Ari and the Peleioites is the elevation of the soul, not merely the release from the purification of Gehenna. So Chaya's overall analysis is that where we are in halacha, on our morning practices after a suicide, reflects where we are in thinking about mental illness. And so after she has spent 10 years of writing about mental illness, she's learned more about mental illness. She spent time working with suicide prevention groups. And also, and she's given me permission to say this, there is another member of her family who is also now struggling with mental illness and has repeatedly tried to end her own life and has been in many programs, and her parents have just been trying everything with her, and yet she still struggles. Kai's overall analysis is that even with the best of intentions and lots of medical intervention, some people cannot be cured from mental illness. And it's not always an illness that can be treated effectively. And this is now me talking, because this is part of the conclusion I came to about my own mother, who was bipolar at a time when lithium was the only medical treatment, and she was one of the 15 to 20% of people who did not respond. Lithium didn't work. So sometimes mental illness is a terminal illness. Therefore, all of our actions must be guided by compassion for the person who has died as well as the survivors. So Chaya's conclusion on this issue of 11 or 12 months is that we should not be making distinctions about this 11 or 12 months based on how someone died. Because who are we to judge? Based on Chaya's experience since writing her tshuva, and some of the things that happened since writing her tshuva is that before her father died, her mother died, and so Chaya has already gone through that period of, the 11 months of saying Kaddish. And also my father died, and she and I talked about our experiences of saying Kaddish for our parents and this 11 or 12 months question in light of that. Chaya believes that we should say Kaddish for 11 months in order to have a substantial break before the first yard site, so that you're really doing something different at the first yard site than you are in those first 11 months. And then after that first yard site, we may continue to say Kaddish whenever we're moved to. So not in this you gotta say it every day for the rest of your life, as the Pele Yoetz says, but with this permission from the Pele Yoetz, and also I believe from conversations that Chaya had with Rebbe Victor and Nadia, that when we're moved to say Kaddish, that we should say Kaddish, that there's a reason that somebody is showing up in our heart that day. I've also learned that Kaddish is a bridge, and so there are times we want to walk that bridge that day, and we want the Kaddish in our life. But knowing that we are doing that after the 12 months based on custom and psychospiritual practice, and that it's important to make the distinction in that later post-12 month time that we're no longer a mourner in the same way, and we're doing something different. Thank you.
Let's all stand up. Yeah. Exactly. Because this is a long session. I did it, I did it, I